Trips are used to light campfires for 6 months. So, what we are seeing is a destruction of knowledge and heritage and an institution that is merit-based, because the old caste system, let's say the old Brahmin priest in the village, would pass on the title to his son. It was a decentralized system, therefore very hard to get rid of. Village by village, you'd have to slaughter people. But if someone chose to become a monk, chose to become a scholar, he had to come to a university. The same holds true today. Today, you come to Allahabad University, or you go to IIT, or you go somewhere. But if you want a merit-based education, if you want your education to be beyond your family, you need an institution. And that institution is suddenly gone. And we embark upon what I call the poisoned chalice of defeat. Nothing succeeds like success, and nothing disintegrates like defeat. And it's not just us. Again, before I left, I would wonder what went wrong with us that we got colonized again and again. And then I drove through the US and saw the Native Americans in their reservations. I've driven across the US 4 times, and I've traveled very widely around the world, and you see the despair, the absolute abject despair, the loss of their culture, the loss of their philosophy, the loss of their language, the loss of their identity, and it's heartbreaking. The same holds true for Latin America, converted to Catholicism in a very brutal way, lorded over by Spanish conquistadores. Even today, you have very much domination by a tiny white elite in Latin America. True, that's changing. Alejandro Toledo won the presidency of Peru, and he's indigenous, and that is changing bit by bit. And so, but the process of decolonization of Latin America, in many ways, in terms of time, has only just begun, because these things don't change like this. And so, of course, I talked about the Americans, but let us not forget, the Maoris have gone through it, the African tribes have gone through it, even the Chinese have had to go through it, and that's why in some ways they're schizophrenic. On the one hand, they think of themselves as the Middle Kingdom, the Congo. On the other hand, they feel they have been humiliated, and therefore they need to stand up. And it's this strange tension in the Chinese mind. And so we are all living through the challenges of being superseded civilizations. Being a superseded officer is bad enough. Being a superseded civilization is terrible. So we had, that poison chalice of defeat, and when the Sultanate came, it wasn't the most tolerant. Initially, Islam was getting used to India, and India was getting used to Islam. And so initially, when it was a conquering state, the poll tax was imposed, jizya. And Persian became the official language. The Mughals took over. Babur is one of my great heroes because he was a swashbuckler. He was a writer, he was a conqueror, he liked gardens, he wrote Tuzke Baburi. I mean, there are few figures in human history on a personal level with whom I identify more than Babur. I mean, I'd like to be like Babur. I'd like to go out and conquer new lands. So I identify with that. And he was a man of culture as well. And he brought in a different version of Islam because he was a tolerant guy. His artillery man was Rumi Khan, an Iranian. He had cobbled together a disparate coalition of exceptional people and come here and forged an empire out of nothing, out of a handful of men. And it was testimony to the weakness of the Sultanate and the Rajput kingdoms of the time, including the much glamorized Rana Sanga, that Babur was able to win despite having far inferior numbers. Now, the Mughal Empire, for all its tolerance, was still a state which had Persian as its language, and it still looked to the Middle East, using the term broadly, for cultural reference. And under Akbar, jizya was finally removed, and the state became much more tolerant. But there was regression under Shah Jahan and, of course, under Aurangzeb. And yet, India had become so culturally used to the idea of Mughal sovereignty that when 1857 came around, and that is why I don't regard 1857 as the first war of Indian independence. I think it wasn't, because it was certainly not a sepoy mutiny alone. But the truth is somewhere in between. It was an attempt to recreate the old order. And we brought back an effete Bahadur Shah Zafar, well into his 80s, a man of no competence and no achievement of significance except minor poetry, to head and resuscitate the Mughal Empire. The Peshwas, for all their battles, could push the Mughal Empire into further decline, but they didn't have the intellectual or the political imagination to create an alternative empire. They were too insular. Their church was too small. It was smaller than the Mughal church. The Marathas couldn't even behave politely with the Rajputs and the Jats and others. They upset everyone. And so they fought the Battle of Panipat alone and lost. And so the point is, there was vacuum. There was this huge top-down structure in India for a very long time. And to the extent that when the English East India Company came, and the third, and this is, I'm talking now about Mai Bap Sarkar era. So the English East India Company came and started gaining precedence. No one realized the significance of such an invader, except Tipu. Tipu Sultan did. But then the Marathas and the Nizams were were too busy backstabbing Tipu instead of putting up a united front. And there's someone from defense studies, and this is very pertinent for us to note. For all the conquests we've had in history, for all the loot of Mahmud of Ghazni, India was still the second largest economic area on the planet. We were never beaten in trade. We were second only to China. We were a prosperous country. We were far more prosperous than Europe. We forget that. But we didn't have one thing, which the Europeans did. Ruthlessness. When Vasco da Gama, the place where I was born, came to India, and there is this fantastic glamorized ballad in Portuguese, the Lusiad, which I read out of curiosity. I'm sure some people have read it. It is Nuno Gomez or someone, I'm forgetting who's written it. My apologies. But the Lusiad is a fascinating book, and it glamorizes the voyages. But what people forget is that Vasco da Gama burnt ships going to Hajj, to Mecca, and they included women and children, and there were women offering gold and pleading clemency. But he did it because he wanted to give the signal that if you didn't purchase the dastak, literally everyone knows what dastak is, the signature, the permit that the Portuguese gave to trade, you would die. Period. No argument. It was a very, shall we say, Judeo-Christian legal view of the world. This is the permit, you buy it, you don't buy it, you die. Very binary. It was absolutely ruthless. And it's surprising that a powerful kingdom of Gujarat, run by a sultan, never really stood up to the tiny Portuguese. After all, they had bases on land. They could have been driven off land. But no, we didn't. India has never been strong on defense. So that was just the trailer. The movie was to come. Dupleix intervened for the first time in the south, and of course Robert Clive took it a scale further. First it was the siege of Arcot, I think, where he made his name, if I don't miss. And then, of course, we all remember the Battle of Plassey, and that's 1757. And if you read British history textbooks, you'd imagine they came here and gave us railways and gave us the English language and gave us Allahabad University. They were very benign, civilizing influences. And brownie fuzzy wuzzies like us, who were savages running around in loincloths, suddenly became global citizens with democracy, rule of law, and of course the English language. That's the operative, dominant English myth. Is that 1757 is when the British take over Bengal, which includes modern-day Bangladesh, West Bengal, Bihar, Orissa, and Jharkhand. Some of Jharkhand, maybe not all. And in barely 15 years, by 1763, a third of the population of Bengal is dead. 10 million people are dead. That's better than the Holocaust. That's a pretty good achievement, right? British did wonderfully well in exploiting India. It was theft. It was daylight robbery. Because Mahmud of Ghazni just took gold from the temples. Sure, Nadir Shah came and took the diamonds that he could pull off the Red Fort. Sure, great. But what the British did was they brought in a system of taxation. You had to pay, let's say, 50% of whatever you produced, whatever you earned. Let's say you had land. You failed to submit your taxes or pay your taxes by Friday 12 noon. Simple binary culture. Your land would be seized, auctioned off to the highest bidder, and that would be further money going to the British Treasury. What happened was the biggest wealth transfer in history. Nothing compares. The Spanish did loot Latin America, but they were not as systematic. They just took the gold. The British took recurring revenues. Year after year, month after month, day after day. They even taxed salt. It would be very, very, very long before a thin old man named Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi would walk to a beach and challenge it. They had a long, long, long time of absolute blanket economic exploitation. And of course, they did it very cleverly. They did it by playing on the fears of everyone, by doing divide and rule, by perpetrating the myth of a benevolent Mai Baap Sarkar that was protecting India, by creating a bureaucracy which sort of was looked up to and venerated, but which had nothing to do with the common man. It was the Sahib, the white Sahib, lording it over. Everyone else, civil lines, etc., these were all British domains. So, what happened to India was, and it's not unique to India, Africa suffered the same thing, lest we forget. Wherever the British went, they were brilliant at sucking out the wealth from that place. They were not like the Belgians doing wanton torture. They were not like the French getting sentimental and sticking on to a colony after it became unprofitable. British were traders. They wanted money. They wanted your money. I mean, I don't know what Professor Faruqi's experience is, but I found that I've traveled now pretty much all around the world, and I find that the stingiest of all people are my British friends. by a long way. By a very long way. I mean, they take gold by such a mile. The next person you can't even see. It's like Jesse Owens and the rest, come jogging, in, and you say, what happened? And it's like, you can feed them 20 times and cook them dinner, and they won't buy you a cup of tea or a drink. And they will, if you tell them they are in the wrong, they will get offended and take the moral high ground, and as sanctimonious hypocrites preach to you for hours. It is incredible, the British ability for moral outrage, despite doing everything underhand and shady, is exceptional. There's a joke in our part of the world, in Hindi of course, ki keel thoko screw niklega. You hammer a nail into their head, it'll come out as a screw. So it's no surprise they had an empire that governed the world. It's no surprise that they won the battle of hegemony. It's no surprise that they were able to culturally colonize everyone. And that brings me to the complicated cultural legacy of the British. And it is particularly pertinent because this is an institution set up by the British. And therefore it has what we call, right from its umbilical cord, a complicated legacy. How does this institution connect itself to the soil around it, whilst not losing some of the wonderful things that indubitably came from the British? And some of the great things that did come from the British were people like Sir William Jones. Some of the things that did come, from the British were people like Sir James Princeps, the deciphering of Brahmi script. The fact of the matter is that many of the 19th century Englishmen, whilst being ruthless colonialists, had an intellectual curiosity and had the swagger and confidence of a dominant class to take risks, whether that meant riding into Lhasa like young husband, or whether it meant, let's figure out this ancient script. They had that swagger. We had lost it. The Chinese had lost it. We had it once, but we'd lost it. Babur had it once. But even the Mughal elite had lost it. The descendants of Babur had become Muhammad Shah Rangila. They wanted to wear fine muslin, and that's about it. So swagger had gone out of our system, regardless of which community or kingdom. These guys had it, and they had an intellectual curiosity, and they were children of the Enlightenment, some of them, and they went out and explored. And it did certainly help us rediscover our past and brought a lot of the richness that we had produced to the world. A lot of Indian history was reconstructed. And of course, we have a historian here who can tell you much more about it than I can. And so we have that from the British. But then, of course, we have someone called Macaulay. On the one hand, you have William Jones extolling Sanskrit as a language superior to Latin and Greek, and then Macaulay comes along and says, look, a shelf of this Oriental literature a shelf of Western literature is worth all the literature from all ages from the East, this garbage that they are being taught. And what we need is an education system, a new education system that creates, and I won't quote because everyone knows Macaulay's quote and it's cliche, but to put it in Spanish terms, we need a comprador class, because if I go and beat someone, it's not so hot. But if I have a comprador class who aspires to be me, who aspires to speak in English, aspires to have white habits, aspires to be, English in taste and manners, he can go and beat the fellow, and there's an intermediary to blame. And, of course, I have cheap help. A whole bureaucracy or a whole constabulary underpay it, thereby making them corrupt, thereby instilling the superior moral image of the white man, and rule. it was brilliant. I mean, very few empire builders have been as brilliant as the British. You have to give the devil its due. Absolutely, phenomenally brilliant. I always fear a British enemy. I've been backstabbed by a few Brits, and I always blame myself that I read history, but I never learned from it. So, I hope going forward, I won't be backstabbed. I touch wood. This is Prayag, Allahabad, so I'll fold my hands. I hope I'll be wiser. They won't change. I hope I get wiser. But going back to the absolute genius of the British was that they decimated Indian confidence in Indian culture. The education system was deracinated from our roots, and we produced what we call the Brown Sahib. And even when we became independent, we still had the Brown Sahib. The ICS became the IAS, the same generalized exam. The IP, Imperial Police, became the IPS. And actually the system didn't change. The 1861 Police Acts persists till this day. It was drafted 4 years after what the British called the Sepoy Mutiny. So we're still living with with those after effects. And just look at Britain. They had professionalized services in their own country. They didn't have these generalized, sprawling elite ruling everything, from intelligence to investigation to paramilitary in the case of the IPS, and from defense to finance in the case of the IAS, even though their performance, especially over the last decade, has been pathetic. And the reason is the world is moving too fast. Even if you are the brightest administrator in the world, you cannot go from being DM of Ghazipur to running finance. The British have a treasury. The Americans have a treasury department. They test you for your knowledge of world economy and your thinking ability regarding finance. And so on and so forth. But that's digressing. The more important point is that we've retained the system because culturally we don't think of systems. And when you start thinking systemically, it said be practical. Because of course, the only person who could think of systems is Benjamin Jowett of Balliol College, who had never ever visited this country and yet drafted the blueprint of how this country is to be governed. And we still don't question the Jowett paradigm. And that is nothing but cultural colonialism or cultural subjugation. And even the big plays we made after independence, Nehru bringing in the idea of the Planning Commission, that was very much inspired by the Soviet model, 5-year plans. He had gone to Harrow. He'd never lived here. He went as a schoolboy. Then he went to Cambridge. He was influenced by Fabian's socialists. I go to the extent of calling him a coconut, a man who was white on the inside but brown on the outside. And they were contending visions for India. The Gandhian vision was much more rooted. Have grassroots democracy. Decentralize, decentralize, decentralize. The village assembly, the town, and so on and so forth can deal with their own affairs. Of course, there's a Patel vision as well of India.